everyone. This is Lecture 9 for Lifespan Development in Social Work. Our topic, as you can see, our topics this week are moral development and aggression. We're going to look at pro-social behavior, developing morality, which is where we get into moral development, and a particular kind of problematic behavior, which is aggression. And we're going to look at aggression across the life cycle and also, excuse me, specific kind of interpersonal types of aggression that we in social work often are faced with. Okay, so why don't we move on here? Moral development really refers to changes in people's sense of justice, of what is right and wrong, and in their behavior related to moral issues. So there are several theoretical approaches that have evolved for trying to explain how moral development occurs, particularly in children. So we're going to look at a few of those. If you remember, earlier in the semester, we reviewed briefly Bandura's social learning approach, or social learning theory, I should say, and we will continue to kind of revisit that, and today is one of those occasions we are revisiting it. A social learning approach to moral behavior or ethical behavior, or behaving in a way that is right or wrong based on the culture's norms, really approaches morality with a focus on how the environment influences children's pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior, basically, to give a very simple definition, is any behavior that is helpful and or benefits others. So the idea is that children observe older members of their community behaving this way. They see that it is highly valued behavior. It is reinforced in some way as well. There may be certain role models in the community that exhibit these behaviors, and so therefore children observe these models and understand that this is very how shall I say, a very important or valuable behavior to engage in, or to mimic, I should say. So in this view, moral conduct is learned through reinforcement and role modeling. It's interesting because research does show that preschoolers are more apt to model the behaviors of warm, responsive adults, and models viewed as highly competent or high in prestige, which is a basic tenet or hypothesis of social learning theory. Children do more than simply mimic modeled behavior, however. Some research has shown that by observing others' behavior, children begin to learn society's norms. And of course, this is exactly what the social learning approach to moral development proposes. Also, children, when children begin to mimic this and engage in this behavior, and as they cognitively develop over time, this leads to what is called abstract modeling, which is the process by which modeling paves the way for the development of more general rules and principles. What that basically means is that children not only know that there are certain behaviors that are valued, but that those behaviors are associated with certain principles, norms, ethics, morals, and so therefore they know that when a person is behaving, let's say an adult is behaving in a particular way, they are not only showing a behavior that's highly valued, but a certain principle or value of the community. Okay, so probably the one theorist who's gotten the most attention, and we're going to spend a little bit more time with, is Lawrence Kohlberg and his theory of moral development. Now, his theory suggests that people pass through a series of stages in the development of moral reasoning and in their sense of justice and their sense of what is right and wrong. And he's divided these into basically 6 stages, or that there are there are 6 stages, but there are 3 categories of these 6 stages. Let's put it this way. There's the pre-conventional morality, which includes stages 1 and 2. There's the conventional morality, which deals with stages 3 and 4. There's also then the post-conventional morality, excuse me, which deals with stages 5 and 6. Now, we're not going to go through each of the stages for each of these types of moralities, if you will, based on Kohlberg's. In fact, the book goes into, and the readings go into far more. There's also a web page that I've directed you to kind of look over this in a little bit more detail. But basically, what Kohlberg means by pre-conventional morality, stages 1 and 2, is that there are concrete interests on the part of the individual as far as what is right and wrong. It's the idea that people are rewarded or punished based on what they do, whether they do what is right or wrong. So it's a very literal sense of right and wrong. We do the right things because we will be rewarded. We avoid doing the wrong things because we will be punished. Then Kohlberg talks about what he called conventional morality, stages 3 and 4, in which people approach moral problems as members of society. This is the idea that there are certain conventions or mores or norms of every culture, of every society, and people engage in right or wrong behavior not only because of the certain punishments or rewards that they may encounter based on what they do, but they also now begin to participate or engage in moral behavior based on the fact that they understand that these are the norms of a society, that there's a bit more of an abstract quality to why they do what they do. They do it not just for the reward, but because society says it's the correct thing to do, and that is the correct thing to do. That is, the person internalizes, to use some other language, internalizes the norms or mores of the excuse me, of the community, of the culture, and just the doing of the correct or moral behavior is in and of itself reinforcing, other than the fact that there may be some literal reward or literal punishment that occurs after somebody engages in a particular kind of behavior. With post-conventional morality, that's stages 5 and 6, this is when people use moral principles that are seen as broader than those of any particular society. What he means by this is that people start to base their behaviors of what is right or wrong, or they base their understanding of what is right is wrong beyond what are, let's say, local conventions or cultural norms. They begin to start thinking about right and wrong in more universal terms. So that there may be, let's say, a universal principle of human rights, let's say. And so this goes above and beyond any local norm or more or national or cultural norm or more. And people now engage in something that is beyond just the conventional morality, or they're basing their behavior, I should say, on more than just what is conceived as conventional morality for the culture or community that the person lives in. Okay, Kohlberg assessed people's moral reasoning using moral dilemmas in his research. And according to Kohlberg, people, he believed, moved through these stages in a fixed order. So this is a stage model of moral development. Kohlberg contested that people are unable to reach the higher stages, unable to reach the highest stage, I should say, that is post-conventional morality, until at least adolescence, due to lack of cognitive development. Kohlberg's theory is a good account of moral judgment, but some have argued that it is not a good account, or it's not adequate at predicting moral behavior. So people may have a certain type of reasoning for why they do what they do, but that doesn't necessarily correlate in specific moral behaviors. His theory does not generalize well to non-Western cultures. And because his theory was based on data from males, it does not necessarily explain or accurately explain a girl's development by placing their moral reasoning at a lower level than that of boys. Now, I don't think he did that purposely. I think what he did in his initial research was to use boys without thinking. He just assumed that boys would be a model for anyone, whether the person was a girl or a boy, right? And so boys or males are kind of the norm, and so therefore it is assumed that whatever boys or males do is the norm. And so this may, in fact, put girls and women at a disadvantage as far as how they are assessed by his particular theory and his particular methodology. So it's biased. Carol Gilligan in particular suggests that there are gender and other cultural influences. She suggests that the way boys and girls are raised in our society leads to differences in moral reasoning. So, for example, she suggests that boys view morality primarily in terms of justice and fairness. Girls, however, see morality in terms of responsibility taking and compassion towards individuals and a willingness to sacrifice for relationships. Gilligan sees morality in girls developing in 3 stages. So she herself came up with a kind of a parallel moral development process specific to girls. The first is what she called orientation towards individual survival. The second she called goodness as self-sacrifice. And then the third she called morality of nonviolence. Now, the orientation toward individual survival is that females concentrate on what is practical and best for them. So it's a very pragmatic, again, a bit more of a concrete approach to what is right and wrong and to the reasoning behind why girls would engage in certain behaviors. Gilligan's idea of goodness as self-sacrifice is that females think they must sacrifice their own wishes to others, what others want. It's the idea that Gilligan proposed that girls and women, females in society, are raised in such a way to be self-sacrificing. So this would be kind of how can I say this? This would be kind of akin to Kohlberg's conventional morality. It's women, girls and women are behaving in an ethical, moral way based on the conventions, the gender norms that are placed on them as being self-sacrificing, and that is a good thing for females to engage in. And then the last stage would be morality of nonviolence, wherein females come to see hurting anyone, including themselves, as unethical and immoral. So this was kind of her approach during the 1980s to kind of counter what was seen as the dominant approach to moral development as hypothesized by Kohlberg. Now, I should say that research in the last few decades shows that, in fact, or I should say not all research, I'm not saying, I shouldn't say this, but not all research shows that males and females differ in their moral reasoning. There may be some differences, but they're not as perhaps as stark as what might be suggested first by Kohlberg and then by Gilligan. Also, when we look at gender and other cultural influences, we see that these are linked to differences in pro-social behaviors, and that that what has been reported consistently. That is that there are just gender-specific, there are prosocial behaviors that are specific to the gender of the individual. So, example, research has shown that girls are reported to be more helpful in general than boys, than their male peers. Boys are less willing to ask for help than girls. We also see this with adults as well. When behavior is public and visible to others, and the target of help is female, males are more likely to help that individual. Gender patterns may be the result, of course, due to cultural orientations. Again, if you think about what Gilligan was saying about goodness as a self-sacrifice, there is a norm, or has been traditionally a norm, that females will be self-sacrificing. And so, therefore, females may tend to hold to a more communal orientation that centers on the interest of relationships and community, which then leads to greater prosocial behavior, not only on the part of girls and women, but to all the communities, to all the individuals within the community. Males are more likely to have an agentic orientation, that is a more individualistic orientation as far as getting things done. And there is some evidence to show that, in fact, males in our society are reinforced and enculturated to be more individualistic in their thinking. And this really leads to some very interesting notions, that we can even think of societies as being more communally focused, oriented, or families are more communally focused and family-centric. That is, the needs of the family are more important, or are given higher valence or value than the needs of the individuals, of each individual within that family unit. And then we have families that are more individualistic. That is, although it is still a family, each of the individual needs of the members of that family are given priority, and that the needs of the whole family may even be, let's say, the needs of the family, or the amount of needs of the family, are less than what might be typically seen in these more family-centric or communal-based societies. Cultural values also have an impact on how much prosocial behavior is displayed by individuals just in general. So when we live in cultures that use what is called rights-based reasoning, I'll get it out, rights-based reasoning. Try to say that very quickly 5 times right now. Okay, rights-based reasoning. This expects individuals, it expects that a society will uphold individual rights for individual citizens, or for every citizen of the society. Then there's what is sometimes called duty-based reasoning, which expects that individuals behave in a certain way due to their responsibility, due to their role, due to their obligations to the group or to society in general. Of course, parenting practices also influence the level of prosocial behaviors displayed by children, and also what prosocial behaviors are emphasized by a family are also influenced by what cultural norms the family exists in, the environment, the social environment that the family lives in. So, for example, children taught to cooperate with family members show higher levels of prosocial behavior with their peers. Reciprocity is another idea around a cultural norm about what is right or wrong, what is valued. Reciprocity is the idea that we should help because we expect to receive help from others in the future. This is a culturally relative value, with some practicing it as a moral obligation, whereas others view it as more of a personal choice. Some subcultures in America may have a higher sense of reciprocity, and other cultures subcultures in America may have a lower sense of reciprocity. So these are just lots of cultural, as well as family, as well as gender-specific influences to moral behavior. Now, let's get into parenting, because lots of people talk about parenting in our society, and that, if the kid's getting in trouble with the law, where are the parents? If the kid's having lots of trouble in the classroom, where are the parents? Meaning, what did the parents do? What are the parents doing to ensure that their child behaves correctly, behaves properly, acts like a good citizen, shall we say? Diana Baumrind and Eleanor Maccoby and their colleagues, they identified what they felt were different types of parenting. And this really focuses on patterns of discipline. They felt that they could identify how parents may instill a sense of right and wrong based on the way in which they disciplined their children. That is, the parents disciplined their children. And they came up with these three broad categories: authoritative, permissive, and authoritarian parents. Now I'm going to start with the bottom and work up. Authoritarian parents are exactly what it sounds like. They're authoritarian. These are parents that are controlling. They tend to be punitive. They tend to be rigid about the rules, the norms within the family. They may show less affection or warmth towards their children. They see the family as in a hierarchy. They are the parents, children are the children, and what the parents say is what is basically law in the home. Authoritarian parents tend to value strictness, unquestioning obedience, and do not tolerate expressions of disagreement from their children. Now again, these are based on Baumrind's and Maccoby's research of family parenting styles. They claimed, Baumrind and Maccoby claimed that children who were raised in such homes tend to be withdrawn, they tend not to be friendly, and they tend to be uneasy around their peers. They also believe that girls become especially dependent on their parents in such homes, and boys can be unusually hostile in these homes. The next kind of parenting that Baumrind and Maccoby and their colleagues identified was permissive parenting. And gee, what does that mean, permissive parenting? Meaning that they're permissive. They are rather lax, they are inconsistent in their feedback, and they require rather little of their children. And the authors, the theorists claim that children who are raised in such homes tend to be similar to children of authoritarian parents, interestingly enough. They can be dependent, they can be moody, they tend to have low social skills, and also tend to have low self-control. And then authoritative parenting. This is a kind of parenting that they identified as being firm, as setting clear and consistent limits or boundaries, but try to reason with their children as to why things are right and wrong, giving explanations for why the parents do what they do and why the children should behave in a particular way. And the authors really believe that children from authoritative parents tended to fare the best. The kids tended to be more independent, they tended to be friendlier with their peers, they tended to be self-assertive, and they tended to be cooperative. They also, children also had a strong motivation to achieve, they were likable, and overall successful. Also, these children tended to regulate their own emotions and regulate their behavior and relationships with others. Children whose parents engage in aspects of the authoritative style related to supportive parenting, which encompasses a lot of parental warmth, proactive teaching, calm discussion during disciplinary episodes, sharing in the interests of the children, involvement in the children's activities and with their peers, etc., etc. I'm not sure if, let me see, Baumrind, I always forget how to pronounce her name, if Baumrind and Macoby actually coined that phrase, supportive parenting, or this is another form, maybe some other thinkers came up with supportive parenting, and it's very similar to what they described as authoritative parenting. There's also the notion of the uninvolved parent, and the uninvolved parent is really kind of another case of the permissive parent, but maybe to more of an extreme. The uninvolved parent is basically the parent who shows almost no interest in their children and tends to be indifferent and even rejecting. In its most extreme form, this style of parenting results in neglect, which is a form of child abuse. Children of such parents are the worst off of their peer group. Children in these from homes tend to report feeling less loved and emotionally detached, and they may even also have physical and cognitive development disruptions because of this form of parenting. Now, of course, most parents are not entirely consistent across any of these styles, if you will, and they may switch from one style to the next, even in the same day, shall we say. But basically, according to this theory of parenting, there is an overall dominant mode in which parents will tend to discipline and interact with their children. Having said all that, you guessed it, there are cultural differences, obviously, in child rearing practices. And what might be found to be problematic in one context, one kind of style of parenting, may not be so problematic in another cultural context. You should know that the families that were used to explore and identify these parenting styles, this research was primarily done during the 60s and I think also into the 70s, so it's somewhat old. Primarily with suburban families and primarily with white middle-class families, I should say. So one would expect that a de-emphasis on hierarchy, an emphasis on independence, an emphasis on reasoning, to this kind of explaining of why something is right and why something is wrong may be more highly valued within those contexts. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, child rearing practices reflect the norms of cultures in which parents themselves were raised in and are now parenting in, and also includes how children are viewed, the nature of childhood, the role of parents, the role of the family, the role of the child in the family, etc. Child rearing practices in Eastern societies are more likely to involve a stricter control. Such control is seen as a measure of the parent's involvement, in fact, in and concern for the welfare of the child. So a more authoritative approach in certain Eastern cultures are viewed as being loving, as being involved, as being responsible. In Western societies, especially in the United States, parents are more often advised to use this more authoritative parenting, which I just described. And children's behavior is in part produced by their own unique genetic endowments. Oh, remember that piece. And their behavior can in turn shape, guess what? Parental behaviors. So we may even see a difference in the kind of parenting style that any one caregiver or parent uses depending on the child that they are interacting with. So even that can shift and change across children in the very same home. But the important piece is that there are different cultural norms, different cultural values where a more permissive style may be more highly valued and may be seen, in fact, as being very loving, as being more inclusive of the child. A more authoritarian approach, I should say, might also be seen as a very loving, involved, responsible parent or caregiver. Okay, so let's move on to our second topic of this lecture, and that's regarding aggression and violence. And I wanted to really look at this because, firstly, social workers were often faced with aggression and violence, or the results of aggression and violence, I guess is a better way of looking at it, in the lives of the people that we work with. And also, aggression and violence is a very specific way of breaking social norms that I think requires special attention. I think in America, this is just my opinion now, I think in America when we think about aggression and violence, we think about kids being aggressive, having a fight in the playground, let's say, or violence is, somebody robbing somebody by gunpoint, or murder, or something of that sort. But really, when we look at aggression and violence in the literature, so much of it occurs between people who know each other, and so much of it occurs very much, interestingly enough, within the family unit, within schools, between neighbors, etc. So I think that's why I wanted to really focus on aggression and violence more at that kind of interpersonal level. Now, what is meant by aggression? It's any intentional activity that is meant to injure or harm another individual. It's intentional injury. It's intentional harm, purposely focusing or targeting another person so as to harm that individual. Now, when we look at human beings at their youngest level, that is, as infants, we notice that infants do not act aggressively. However, by the preschool years, children demonstrate their ability to be aggressive. Aggressive acts in young children are often related to attaining a desired goal. We start seeing this particularly with toddlers and with younger children when they're playing with toys, and one child has a toy that another child wants at that moment, and the one who wants the toy becomes aggressive in order to get that toy. Aggression declines as children move through the preschool years, as does the frequency and average length of episodes of aggressive behavior. So believe it or not, toddlers tend to be more aggressive than older children, school-aged children. That's because toddlers will tend to engage in aggressive behavior much more often, more regularly, but the level of aggression is less intense. Okay, just think about that. Why is this? This is due to both personality, I should say, let me put it in the order in which we have studied these. This is due to changes in cognitive abilities, personality development, and social developments. So the more a child develops cognitively, personally, emotionally, and interpersonally, socially, they tend to be less aggressive. They tend to engage in less aggressive acts. In fact, throughout the preschool years, children really begin to develop emotional self-regulation. And what is meant by emotional self-regulation is the capacity to adjust emotions to a desired state and level of intensity. Learning to talk about feelings, engaging in strategies to regulate feelings, all of this begins about the age of 2. starts that early. As the brain develops, as the child develops greater cognitive skills and understanding about the environment, they understand that, first of all, certain emotional expression is more appropriate in some circumstances over other circumstances. That's the first thing. And secondly, they have the cognitive ability to now monitor themselves and therefore then intervene with themselves in their emotions. So that means self-control and also developing social skills contribute to this ability to self-regulate, to emotionally self-regulate. Also, the advancement of language. It didn't include that, but language development also is very important to self-regulation because language permits the individual to negotiate. And as children are able to start to negotiate, they can start to reason and therefore then start to regulate their emotion. Now, having said all that, aggressivity, or the amount of aggression that any one individual persists in, is a relatively stable trait according to the literature. The most aggressive preschoolers tend to be the most aggressive school-aged children. So at least in childhood, we see a relative stability in who's going to be more aggressive and who's going to be less aggressive. Boys also typically show a higher level of instrumental aggression. Now, instrumental aggression is motivated by the desire to obtain a certain goal, such as, like I said, playing with a toy that another child is using. We also notice that aggression on the part of boys in general tend to be more physical in nature. Girls typically demonstrate what is called relational aggression. This is non-physical aggression that is intended to hurt another person's feelings. So boys might swing their fists, and girls might use words to embarrass or to hurt another person. Now, where does aggression come from? There's been lots of theories as to why, and there's a reason why, once again, we have these kids watching TV. We'll get into that in a moment. But there are varying different degrees of or explanations for aggressive behaviors, particularly in children. Freud, of course, claimed that we have a death drive or a death instinct which leads us to act aggressively. Konrad Lorenz argued that humans, like all animals, share a fighting instinct, that there's a fight or flight instinct, and so it was innate to us as a species. Sociobiologists more recently considered the biological roots of social behavior, and they argue that aggression facilitates the goals of strengthening the species and the gene pool in general. It strengthens the individual. Now we're really going way back in time again. This is more kind of a sociobiologists are similar, in my mind, are similar to evolutionary biologists in that they look at social behaviors in the evolutionary, perhaps, this is speculative, mind you, but what may have been the evolutionary advantages for our species developing a certain kind of sociability, a certain style of interacting with each other. And so they claim that aggression may have served not only individuals but communities as a way of surviving, particularly in environments or during periods of time when resources were scarce. Social learning approaches contend that, guess what? Aggression is based on prior learning through, guess what? Observation, reinforcement, role modeling, etc. And of course, as I said earlier in the semester, and I really love this picture, that one of the main tributaries of research that came out of social learning theory was this notion that children learn to be aggressive or become more aggressive by watching programs on TV that show a lot of violence. And so it's based on this idea that they observe, that there are role models on television, and then the children mimic that and imitate that behavior. And I'll get into that more in a minute. Elmer Bandura, again, is the main theorist of social learning theory. He was able to demonstrate this, and one of his first studies dealt with the aggressivity of preschoolers. And he did this with the famous Bobo doll experiments. I would love to have shown you a picture of the Bobo doll experiments, but they're copyrighted, and so I don't have. Let's put it this way: if you go to any major search engine, put in Bobo doll experiment, and click on photos, you'll see pictures of the Bobo doll. And basically, it was an experiment that exposed children to watching a Confederate, in this case a young woman, who walked into a playroom. The children had never seen the Confederate. They had never seen the playroom before. They just observed what she was doing. She would act in certain aggressive ways. She would punch the Bobo doll. Bad Bobo, bad Bobo. She would take she'd kick the doll. It's a fairly big doll, inflated doll, and that bounces about very easily. And if you punch it, it bounces back up again. And she would take a little play hammer and she would, hit Bobo on the head, that kind of thing. And then when the children were permitted to go into the room themselves, individually, not as a group, but individually, it was remarkable at how similar the kids behaved to the role model that they had just witnessed, maybe half an hour ago, or however much time it was between their observing the model and then being permitted into the playroom. So this was one of the first experiments to demonstrate how people can observe purely by observing, not having to be reinforced directly or punished directly, but just observing, seeing what other people do, and then engaging in their behavior at a later time. Now, does viewing violence on TV matter? There's been lots of research, or at least some research, regarding this. Children's television programs do contain high levels of violence. About 69% of the programs, of any given program, has violence in it than other programs, believe it or not. I was shocked when I saw the statistic that kids programming has more violence in it than programming that is geared towards adults. That I find hard to believe. But I think when we talk about aggression now, they're talking about aggression in a very broad sense of the term. Again, they're not talking about aggression about, let's say, one character kills and murders another character. We're just talking about even playful, animated violence that occurs on a program. In an average hour, children's programs contain more than twice as many violent incidents as any other type of program on TV. The overwhelming weight of research is clear in suggesting that the observing of televised aggression by children does lead to readiness, at least, to act more aggressively, to bully, and to be insensitive to the suffering of victims of violence. Another way of saying that is that viewing violence on the part of children, even if it's in cartoons, tends to lower their sensitivity to violence. Either they may be more likely to engage in it, perhaps if they are already aggressive, they may tend to be even more aggressive, or if they're not aggressive, they may be less likely to intervene when they view aggression in their environments. Video games have also been targeted in this research. Of course, we know video games also contain aggression and violence, and data suggests that experience with such games may put children at greater risk for acting aggressively. Notice I said may. I think the research is a little bit more equivocal. It's not quite as... I think there's more studies to counter this hypothesis than to support it. I should say this. There's a lot of research to support this idea that video games can encourage violence in children, but there's a lot of research there's a solid minority of research that counters that it doesn't show that at all. The results are non-significant. Some 14% of children aged 3 and younger, and about half of those aged 4 to 6 do play video games. So it's a big, and I bet that number is increasing even as we talk. Of course, social learning principles suggest ways to decrease the risk by helping children interpret violent programs differently. So children can be explicitly taught to view violence more skeptically, as not being representative of the real world. They can be taught that violence can affect themselves and other people negatively. They can be taught not to imitate the behavior, interestingly enough. So there is some research to suggest that when caregivers of children are engaged in what the kids are watching and then kind of talk them through the process. Well, doing that is not such a good thing. If you really were to do that in real life, that would hurt somebody. Or, this is just pretend. We don't really act this way. That kind of engagement with children when they're watching more aggressive shows actually can mitigate the influence it has on the children's behavior. Also, research shows that non-aggressive models can reduce aggression by demonstrating how to avoid confrontation and control aggression. So it works both ways. Children can learn through role models who are not aggressive to be, guess what, not aggressive. Now, there's also some literature to say that besides social learning theory, or what sociobiologists have suggested, that the ability to be aggressive and also to be empathetic, we talked about this earlier in the semester, is also a sign of cognitive development and growth. So cognitive approaches to violence argue that aggression stems, at least in part, from the manner in which children interpret others' actions and situations. Kenneth Dodge and his colleagues, for example, point out that some children are more prone than others to assume aggressive motivations on the part of others. Another child bumps into child A, and that child A may be more prone to interpret that as an aggressive act. These kids tend to not be able to pay attention to appropriate cues and inaccurately interpret behaviors as being more intentionally hostile. And then, of course, this leads them to be more hostile themselves. So the notion is that some children may have a difficulty with being more aggressive because their cognitive skills are such that they misinterpret the behavior of others in such a way that they assume hostile intentions more often than most others. Of course, this approach does not explain why children fail to misattribute hostility to others. That is, sometimes children miss that people are being hostile to them when in fact they are being hostile to them. So this specific approach by Dodge and his colleagues does not really address that issue. But development of cognitive abilities does mean that, as we've just already talked about, that children will be more aggressive and then also develop more greater ability to self-regulate their emotional responses. Now, American culture, I would argue, is we tend to accept violence more in our entertainment than, let's say, in other cultures. So, for example, perhaps we would see TV programs might have a lot, now I'm talking about TV programs aimed at adults or teenagers, may have more action in it, more conflict in it, more overt conflict in it, concrete, fights, that kind of thing. But nonetheless, despite that fact, we see that other cultures also experience high levels of violence to a greater or lesser extent than what we see in the United States. Now, there are cross-cultural differences in the amount of aggression committed by children towards adults and other children, and it appears that cultural child rearing practices moderate the patterns of aggression in children. So depending on what the cultural norms are around child rearing, we may see children be more, on average, more aggressive than children in other cultures. Some research shows that mothers' reactions to aggression relate to children's overall aggression levels. But this relation is complicated by lots of variables, including activity levels of children and the rate at which they learn the social views of their culture regarding aggression. What this means is that sometimes moms might be more sensitive to a level of aggression on the part of a child than on another child's part, or they may be more sensitive to aggression based on cultural norms versus mothers in other cultures. Okay. Interestingly enough, gender differences appear consistently across cultures when it comes to aggression. There's no definitive explanation as to why males engage in higher levels of aggression in basically every culture than females. But it's a pretty universal, it's a fairly universal finding. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule when it comes to human behavior, but more times than not, we see this across cultures. Okay, let's now move specifically to more interpersonal forms of violence. In this case, we're going to talk about school violence and bullying. This has gotten a lot of attention recently, particularly in the mainstream press, particularly the bullying that children face in middle school as well as in high school and even going into college age. Bullying includes any of the following: threats, torments, mocking, actual violence against the other child. So bullying then is whenever a child or a teen or a group of children or teens target another child or teen with these threats, with torments, with mocking, and or violence. It can include all of the above. It might just be one of these or all of these. Cyberbullying in particular is a very specific, kind of more novel form of this, when a child, a preteen or a teen, is tormented, threatened, harassed, humiliated, embarrassed, or otherwise targeted by other children using the internet and other interactive digital technologies or mobile phones. So a classic form of threatening would be that a group of kids keep calling a child's cell phone number over and over, and they text message over and over threats or nasty comments, or they spread a rumor on Facebook about the child that of course is not true, which then may hit the school itself and then actually be spread word to word, mouth to mouth in the school itself. Now, interestingly enough, having said all this about bullying, and given all the attention that bullying has gotten in the media, research shows that there has been a relative decline in the amount of violence perpetrated in schools. The actual risk of experience bullying is actually relatively low. That's not to say that there aren't conflicts between kids or that kids don't bully other kids regularly. They do. But when a child is specifically targeted, repeatedly bullied, that tends to be the exception to the rule for most children. Also, during the 90s in particular, and during the 2000 aughts, as I call them, we saw quite a number of school shootings where, particularly in high schools, this of course received a great deal of attention, understandably so, where children, teens in this case, specifically got weapons, went to the school and specifically targeted with the intent to kill, or at least maim other children, other teens, I should say, and as well as other as well as faculty, I should say, or students and staff. But school shootings are also, again, relatively rare. There are several characteristics identified by the FBI that typically there's a certain profile when an adolescent in particular might engage in this kind of very violent behavior. Typically there's a low tolerance for frustration, there are poor coping skills, there's a lack of resiliency, there may be a failed love relationship, there's resentment over perceived injustices, there's overall depression, there's a certain self-centeredness, I should say, and there's a sense of alienation from in this case it would be the school community. Elliot Aronson points out that students who act violently in school are often targets of bullying or have been rejected themselves. So sometimes we get two kinds of targets of bullying. We get those who are the more quiet, more introverted children who tend to be rather smart, maybe very articulate, and they are targeted for bullying by others. Or we get children who are aggressive themselves. Maybe they have poor social skills, they may be loud, they don't realize or they don't understand how they may come across to others, and they may also be targeted for bullying, and they themselves also bully. And of course there have been lots of school programs recently that have focused on diminishing school violence and bullying. Please look at some of the extra videos and websites, I should say, that I've suggested to you about bullying. There's some really important information online. There's the one site called It Gets Better that is specifically there to help LGBT youth who may feel particularly targeted by their peers, who are bullied by their peers. And these are videos done by thousands and thousands of people meant to encourage kids to realize that school life does eventually change, and circumstances do eventually change, and that there is some hope in the future for these kids. So please look at that. Also, if I remember correctly, this is the week that I have you do a specific, a real case about a child who was a kid who was bullied, and the consequences that resulted from that. And I really want you to look at that as well. I'm pretty sure this is the week that, if not, then it's next week. I don't remember. It's got to be this week, though. It's perfect for this week. Okay, anyway, we're now going to move into family violence, specific forms of family violence. We're going to look at spousal abuse, we're going to look at child abuse, and then we're going to look at elder abuse. And these are all very, very common kinds of issues that we as social workers are faced with in our work. Spousal abuse, also known as domestic violence, is one of the unfortunate and ugly truths about marriage, and is occurring in epidemic levels. Some form of violence happens in at least 1/4 of all marriages, and we're just talking about marriages now. We're not even talking about domestic partnerships. More than half of all women murdered are murdered by a romantic partner. Between 21 to 34% of women will have been slapped, kicked, beaten, choked, or threatened or attacked with a weapon at least once by a romantic partner. Close to 15% of marriages in the U.S. are characterized by a continuing pattern of severe violence. So this is not something that is out of the ordinary. Violence, this kind of spousal violence, occurs across all social strata, across all ethnic groups, and across all religious communities. It should be noted that it is mostly men who abuse males who abuse their female partners, but about 8% of domestic abuse cases do involve females physically abusing their male partners. There is also research to show that there is spousal abuse in same-sex couples where one partner will abuse the other partner pretty consistently. Lots of people assume that just because you have two men or two women in a relationship that there may not, that well, of course they're equal, so to speak, and of course this would not happen. And that's why also when women are abusing their male partners, society has tended to look at that and even rolled its eyes at it and saying, well, that's not possible. But in fact, it is possible. It is true that the majority of cases of partner abuse is a male partner against the female partner, but there are also examples of women abusing men and then also abuse in same-sex couples. Certain factors increase the likelihood of this kind of abuse. Spousal abuse is more likely in larger families where there is economic concern and a lot of high verbal aggression relative to families where these factors are not present. Partners who grow up in violent homes are more likely to be violent as adults. I do want to add this caveat that just because somebody grew up in that kind of home does not necessarily mean that they will be more likely to either victimize or be victimized in future relationships. But it is a risk factor for some adults. According to Lenore Walker, there are 3 stages of this marital aggression, if you will. The first is the tension-building stage, where a batterer becomes upset, increasingly becomes dissatisfied, and initially expresses this upset verbally, and usually through verbal abuse, through humiliating, threatening language. The next is the active battering incident, where the physical abuse actually occurs. And then finally there's what she calls the loving or contrite stage, which occurs in some, doesn't always occur in all cases, but for some cases the batterer may feel remorse, may apologize, may even promise that they will never do it again, but then the pattern repeats itself again in the future. Typically those who are battered often feel that it is somehow their fault that they are the targets. This may explain why women or anyone who's abused in a relationship may stay in the relationship. Another thing is some people stay out of fear. Some people stay out of economic necessity. They don't understand. They may fear or not. They're not quite sure how they could manage economically if they were to leave their partner. This may be particularly true within immigrant communities, where the first language of a woman may not be English. She may not have many skills. There may be even be certain taboos about women working or doing a lot of work outside of the home, and so she may feel trapped due to economic circumstances. Many women have grown up in a violent home, and they may think that this is normative, that every once in a while a guy will whack you, so to speak, will kind of swing at you, and so that this is normative. Anyway, according to this cycle of violence hypothesis, abuse and neglect that children suffer predisposes them as adults to abuse and neglect their own children, or their own spouses, I should say, in this case. Again, I want to be very cautious about that. Yes, there is evidence to show that that puts an individual at risk for participating in that kind of behavior later in life, but it is not a destiny. The vast majority of people who grow up in very dysfunctional homes actually survive and thrive in adulthood relatively well. The cultural roots of domestic violence, there have been many conversations about what contributes to this kind of violence. Wife battering, some historians and anthropologists and sociologists have stated that wife battering tends to be particularly prevalent in cultures in which women are viewed as inferior to men. So, for example, in British law, husbands were allowed to beat their wives. They had a right to that. This law was eventually amended to permit only beating the wife with a stick that was no thicker than a man's thumb. So that's where the phrase rule of thumb comes from. Wife beating was not made illegal in the United States into the late 19th century. Some also argue, particularly from a feminist perspective, that traditional gender stereotypes and roles of power structures lie at the root of abuse. When women in a community or culture have lower status, or females have lower status to that of males, they become easier targets. When they have higher status, they are threatening to their husbands. So both of these could contribute to, this is kind of a very basic, I might add, simple way of explaining a feminist take on or theory as to why domestic violence occurs. But there's lots of reading online to look at that as well. Next is child abuse. This is again, a very sometimes grim a situation, a grim side of American family life. Statistics again: 5 children are killed by their caregivers every day. Approximately 140,000 others are physically injured every year. 3 million children are abused or neglected annually in the United States, and there's a belief that in fact these numbers are underreported. Child abuse can of course occur in any home, and child abuse includes not only physical violence but also physical threats, mocking. Think of it as bullying by a parent, as well as neglect. So a caregiver can engage in all of those behaviors or some of those behaviors. Okay? There are certain characteristics of homes that tend to have more reports made of child abuse, I'm going to put it that way, than other home structures. And I say that because there may be good reasons why these households are more likely to be reported than other homes. So, homes where there is ongoing poverty, single-parent homes, families with high levels of marital discord, and just overall discord within the family. Most parents who do engage in abuse report that that is not their intent. They never intended to abuse their children, but they abuse nonetheless. Victims do have some similarities. Children who are fussy, children who are resistant to control, children who are slow to adapt to new situations, children who are overly anxious, frequent bedwetters, children who have developmental delays, tend to be targeted more for abuse than other children. Also, children between the ages of 3 to 4 and 15 to 17 are more likely to be abused than other age groups. That's an interesting thing. Think about those ages and why that might be the case. Again, I want to be clear that just because a child grows up in this kind of environment doesn't necessarily mean that this is not destiny for them. It doesn't mean that if they do become parents later on as adults, that they themselves then engage in this behavior. Also, just because we identify the characteristics of what may make children at higher risk for child abuse doesn't mean that they are responsible for the abuse. It means basically that from research we know that there tends to be certain general patterns in the literature as to kids who tend to be targeted more often. Again, there are many reasons for child abuse. One thing that I did not cover in this was sexual abuse. We also have to include that as well. And we're not going to specifically look at sexual abuse, at least with this, with this portion of this particular lecture, but that is also considered a part of child abuse. Okay, I'm going to move on to elder abuse. And elder abuse is when older individuals are physically or psychologically mistreated or neglected. And these are typically people over the age of 60 or even older. Typically it's older than that. And elder abuse impacts or affects up to 2 million people. So this is a fairly, this is a big problem as well. Again, whenever we use estimates as to how often something such as abuse like this, including elder abuse, occurs, we assume that it is probably an underestimate, as victims may be too embarrassed or humiliated or even know that they have a right to report that they are being abused. Elder abuse is most frequently committed by a family member, and typically includes people with Alzheimer's. The victim, I should say, is typically somebody with Alzheimer's or other dementia, and they are particularly likely to be targets, which then of course means that they are less likely to report due to their dementia and cognitive difficulties. So it typically involves caregiving on the part of another family member on that of the older adult. Elder abusers can be a spouse, it can be a child, an adult-age child. It can be a caregiver that is hired to come into the home and watch over the individual. So there can be different individuals that are involved with elder abuse. Research shows that the best prevention for this kind of abuse is typically respite care for the caregiver, and asking for assistance, so that in this case particularly the family caregiver is not so alone in the process of taking care of the older adult. Okay, I'm losing my voice. I think that's a good sign that it's time to move on. Thank you for your attention in this week's lecture. See you next week.